start on October 7th. That's one of the favorite slogans of the people who justify what happened on October 7th, what Hamas did, what the Palestinians joined in doing as soon as they found out and were able to. And when that slogan has something added to it, it's usually history started in 1948, or specifically the issues in the Middle East started in 1948. Now, that also is untrue, and we are here to talk about the specifics of what happened around the formation of Israel, the Declaration of Independence of Israel, and the so-called Nakba, as the Palestinians and pro-Palestinians around the world call it. Nakba, the Arabic word for disaster. Welcome to the reality show for the first time ever in front of a live audience, hopefully the first of many times. I'm Razi Ginsburg. I'm joined by Richard and Marco. Richard, let's go into that term Nakba a little bit and try to unpack it if that's to the extent it's possible.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think the term Nakba is part of the problem here because it's very generic and it kind of means whatever people want it to mean over time. Now, obviously, the word itself means catastrophe, but people have instigated it as a term. And if you ask a random bunch of people on a flip chart to indicate what it means, they would throw phrases up there like the Jews' fault or Palestinians were victims. They wouldn't necessarily know of what, they wouldn't necessarily know of when, but they know it as some oppression of Palestinians by Jews. That's how they would term it. And it's such a flabby term that has no content when you really look at it. I mean, you can look back at what the actual evidence in history is of the events, but then we need to set them within a context. So I think what this is both a term which changes over time and becomes ever bigger, and also is time specific in the sense that it's always one of those pillars which is supposed to start the victimhood of the Palestinians, which to this day is what's used to justify October the 7th and the subsequent events in Gaza. I think it's also a highly emotionally charged term, and emotion is the only point. You're supposed to say Nakba and feel disgust at Jews and cheer for Palestinians, and that is all you need to know. That is the extent to which it's supposed to have cognitive content, is simply to induce a cheering of one side and the slaughter of another.
Yeah, I mean, ignoring context is as important a part of the Palestinian cause, especially when sold to Westerners as redefining, or intentionally misdefining terms. Marco.
Yeah, and if you thought that the term Nakba is woolly, well, the term Palestinian is even more woolly because the population living in the area before the 6 Days War in 1967 were known as Palestinian Arab, Palestinian being the area in the Levant that takes the name as far back as the Romans occupation, 2,000 years ago. So when we're talking about Palestinians right now, we're talking about a made-up ethnicity which effectively took its current nature in the 60s, early 70s. So every time you hear the Palestinians were displaced in 48, well, A, is not true for the reason we're going to look at later on. And B, we're not talking about the Palestinians as a ethnicity which has deliberately been moved away from the land where Israel is now. And of course, the claim about the land, belonging to the land, is essential if you want to create a backbone to the story of the Palestinians. And that's why you need to have a Nakba, you need to have a moving on people, because that implies that there were a people in the first place. So this whole thing, once you analyze in the context of blaming Israel for anything, you need to create the myth of the Nakba and the fact that the population are the victims of this event.
Yeah. Now, when they talk about it started in 1948, of course, 1948, May 14th, to be specific, 1948 is when Israel declared independence. The next day, as I'm sure most of our viewers know, Arab armies of 7 Arab countries decided to attack Israel and make sure that country does not exist more than a short period of time. But what people don't often refer to is the months before that. So Israel, the partition plan for Palestine, which was controlled by the British mandate, was to form a Jewish state alongside another Arab state, and that was approved by the United Nations on November 29th, 1947. Immediately following that, there were already attacks on Jews. Now, there were attacks on Jews before that, but there were attacks on Jews not just in what later became Israel, not just in the areas that later were taken over by Jordan or Egypt, but throughout the Arab world where Jews were living at the time. We hear about displacement. We don't hear about displacement of Jews, but we also don't hear about the mass murder of Jews immediately following the partition plan being approved in the United Nations, Richard.
And of course, you've got to place this into a wider context that follows the Second World War and all of the mass slaughter that took place across the world during that. And that also framed some of the British attitude to what was going on at the time. And of course, you've got the fact that not only does Britain want to be shot at this problematic area, I watched a Pathé News piece which showed that they were really keen to get rid of the burden of Palestine, and it was a thankless task having run the mandate anyway, it said within the piece. And I think that kind of reflects their attitude towards it. But of course, the British don't don't do themselves any favors in terms of our evaluation of them today or then, because of their relentless pragmatism that took place at the time. And the fact that they chose to go for such a degree of neutrality, even when it came to that big vote at the UN, choosing to abstain, which only favored the Arab states and effectively threw the Jews under a bus in terms of denying them the support that they should have had. But nevertheless, it did pass, of course. I think the point about the UK is really that because of that neutrality, it's always worked against the Jews. And that same mentality is here today in 2025, with that same neutrality being favored in terms of there's two sides to this conflict. And, we should both have their perspectives, both have their arguments. And again, that simply throws the Jews under a bus. It doesn't recognize the moral differences between the aggressor, the initiator of force, and the country, Israel, that's trying to defend itself, just as it was when those 7 armies surrounded it on all sides with an attempt to start a holy war and to wipe out the chance for Israel, the Jewish state, to even begin to exist in the first place.
Yeah. Interestingly, Britain was pro-Zionist. At a certain point, I mean, the Balfour Declaration was, the Jews will get a state in Palestine, they changed their mind, and they changed their mind in an interesting period of time, the late 30s, when Europe's Jews were being sent to the gas chambers, when Arabs kind of made clear how eager they are to get rid of the Jews, and Britain seemed to say, well, okay, we didn't know you were that serious about killing all the Jews, so we're going to back off from our support for the Zionist movement and move our support to the Arabs. Yeah, eventually they abstained in the vote, but Britain was very much helping the Arab fight against the Jews and against the establishment of a Jewish state. We were talking in our production meeting, and I mentioned how this reminds me a bit of Ukraine, and when Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, the West was condemning it, but was assuming that it's a matter of days until Russian tanks are in Kiev and it's all over. So why bother? And then when they saw Ukraine fighting back, they're like, okay, you know what? We can support them now. By the way, this was true in one direction and not always in the other one. But yeah, that was Britain's approach to the establishment of the State of Israel.
And of course, the role of Britain took place when, after the First War, the old Ottoman Empire, which lost the war, was partitioned between France, the Levantine area was partitioned between France, who took Lebanon and bits of Syria, and Britain, the British Empire at the time, which took the area of northern Iraq, Transjordania, now called Jordania, and the land of what was Israel now. The British Empire having already Egypt as one of their domains, if you like. So after the First War, the local Arabs didn't really like the Jews in the first place because they supported the Nazi side against just because they were against the Jews. So even during the Second War, they took a very specific position in terms of support, trying to undermine the presence of the Jews in the area. So the kind of hate and violence towards the Jews kind of dragged on since the end of the First War in different guises. First losing the First World War, then supporting the Nazi and losing the Second War as well. And of course, in 48, when the UN, sorry, 47 really, at the end of 47, the UN passed Resolution 181 establishing the two territories. The Arabs didn't like it. So what did they do? They attacked Israel. 5 different Arab countries attacked Israel with the intention of stopping what the UN has established. I mean, frankly, if you look at the plan that the UN put through in the resolution, having blobs of state built in within Israel itself, there was never going to be a functioning solution. If anything else, because even the politicians at the time were saying that there is no way that those two populations will actually cohabit together. That's the idea of the separation of the state, was assumed that the Arabs would stay in their little areas and be happy with it. But it chose not to be. And then since then onwards, they attacked the Jews relentlessly. And their state aim is to get rid of the state of Israel. They do not want the existence of any form of a state of Israel.
Thank you, Bonnie, for the super chat. Yeah, we're going to put some of the resources in the description. The main one we used was an episode of the documentary series Pillar of Fire, episode 7. I highly recommend watching that entire series. One thing that's really memorable from that episode is when there's a quote. I think it's the Egyptian king at the time it was, but somebody from Egypt who was saying, this is not going to be a war, it's going to be a parade, and we're going to be in Tel Aviv in 2 weeks. This is when they launched the war on May 15th, 1948. And this was assumed around the world. I mean, within the Zionist movement, there was an expectation that there will be a fierce battle against the Arabs who were already there, and there was, of course, and that they have a 50-50 chance of winning. And once Arab countries decided to get involved, that chance looked much worse. Of course, we know how it ended. But another point, interestingly, about the Nakba, the disaster being 1948, kind of exposes the idea that anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism or such claims. Why 1948 specifically? Because if the Palestinian people, or these ancient people who had always wanted a state, why is it not, when the British were ruling there? Why is that not a Nakba? Why not when the Ottomans were ruling there? Why is there not a Nakba, between 48 and 67 when Jordan rules the West Bank and Egypt rules Gaza? So that is a question that I encourage those of you watching to ask your Palestinian friends. I encourage you not to have Palestinian friends, but or pro-Palestinian friends. But if you are going to have them, that's a good question to ask.
Yeah, I think it's the expectation that the British had that the Arabs were likely to win in that cakewalk, in that easy parade, which is what made them sit on the fence for so long. And also is one of the reasons that that the UK went for such a pragmatist approach in this. I think when it comes to the Nakba itself, what is the catastrophe? Is it the catastrophe that Israel was formed in the first place, and that is such a humiliation to the Arabs who never wanted it to exist? And that is the disaster they're really referring to. Because often when they're talking about the displacement of peoples, and we can get into the scale to which that was genuinely the case, obviously the number that you hear most bandied about is around 800,000 Arabs, but we're talking about various villages, and we're talking about an area of land that was largely desert at the time, lots of it highly underdeveloped. It's easy to picture Israel as it is today and see it as a much earlier version of that in a way that London would have been, say, but of course it's not. And the early footage of it really shows just how barren and desolate much of the country was. I think so what is the Nakba? Is it also the fact that that some of the people during this turbulent time, this time of war, some of the Arab Palestinians, and I'll call them that to be clear, who lived in that region, realized where the direction was heading, realized that war was coming, and were encouraged by the other Arab leaders across the region to evacuate. And within this documentary that Razi referred to, the Pillar of Fire documentary, it mentioned that the first 30,000 of those Arabs to leave were the well-to-do Arabs, who clearly could see the direction it was coming in, wanted to take them and their stuff out of the region, and therefore a chunk of it was certainly voluntary, or at least a necessary first step, given the state of the place at the time.
Yeah, the numbers game is something we know also from today's conflict and the propaganda around it, but it's interesting the way it happened and the claims that Israel did it by force, when of course in many cases, in some cases maybe they did, or they definitely did. In most cases, as far as we know, it was people leaving because they expected to come back, and that's why they were calling themselves refugees. They expected to come back to a Jew-free country, and that has yet to materialize. Marco.
Yeah, and the idea that people were displaced during the war with the five Arabic states that attacked Israel. Well, that happens all the time. Every time you have an area where a war is going on, population tend to escape. Most people that have a bit of brain tend to move away from the area where they could lose their life as collateral damage. And of course, that's happened throughout any kind of war. For example, the Eastern Republic used to be Italian before the second war. Italy lost the war, and the border changed. So the Italian they used to live in what used to be Italy, and now it's Yugoslavia. They found themselves effectively displaced, but they chose not to fight forever and place bombs and kill people in order to go back to the land to which they had rights. The same thing for the population of border with France and Germany, which is a notorious border has been changed throughout the centuries. And for example, there's a German town called ARCUK, used to be called Aix-la-Chapelle, French, and now it's German. But the population choose not to behave like thugs and destroy the Germans or the French, claiming allegiance or belonging to the land where their ancestor came from. So in the end, yes, they've been displaced because they were at war. Part of the displacement was voluntary, part was forced. Fair enough. But this happened 80 years ago, and the descendants of these people could have chosen to live peacefully in the land of Israel. Israel was founded with the idea of collaboration between peoples, tolerant for religion, tolerant for race, all sorts of stuff that it's unheard of in the Middle East to this day.
One of the most infamous incidents, and when pro-Palestinian people refer to history, this is something they'll often refer to, is happened about a month before Israel declared its independence. In April of 1948, the Deir Yassin, I don't know what to call it. They probably most often refer to as a massacre, but this is an Arab village of Deir Yassin where the Irgun, which was a Jewish militia, not associated with the official, or not part of the official army that later became the IDF, attacked this Arab village. Now, the stories that came out at the time were 250 people were massacred, women and children, and so on and so forth. By the way, the Palestinians, as they're now called, have revised those numbers to, according to a study by a Palestinian university, 107. But this revision happened in 1988 and is not still widely accepted. But yeah, that was from 250 to 107. So there were questions around it at the time, but and still are today. But at the time, this was, of course, believed, and was believed by Arabs, other Arabs living in the area, and this prompted Arabs to leave, which is interesting. Interesting, and of course, we see the propaganda today. A couple of days ago on this channel, we talked about Israel bombing Al Ali Hospital in Gaza, bombing, of course, with 0 people being killed. And in the article that we were talking about on that show, a BBC article, it mentioned that Al Ali Hospital was also bombed in October 2023. That hundreds died. Israel claims it was Palestinian Islamic Jihad misfired rocket. The Palestinians claim it Israel. Of course, this is not how the BBC reported it after they reported the Palestinian lie. They had to apologize, that they had to revise their whole way of reporting. And every time they report Hamas numbers, they have to say, as reported by the Gaza Health Ministry, which is run by Hamas. But we see this as an ongoing thing. This is a part of the propaganda war in Israel. Is they lie regularly. I mean, this is a part, when they think they can get away with it, they lie. When they know that they're elements of the propaganda machine in the West will repeat their lies, they lie. Again, Jeremy Corbyn still has that tweet from October 17th up on his Twitter. So yeah, from Deir Yassin to Al Ali Hospital, nothing has changed, Richard.
And when it comes to Deir Yassin, that's a village that's just to the west of Jerusalem, on elevated land. It had a military purpose to take the village. It wasn't a sudden desire to slaughter the people there by any means. And of course, but that's how it's claimed to be, with the inflated number that Razi referred to there. Or also, the opposite is also claimed. In either case, the Jews are presented as the bad guys, because when the number is accepted as having been inflated, it's declared that it's a Jewish conspiracy to scare the Arab people by inflating the number of deaths and causing them to flee the other villages in the area and evacuate, which is a lot of people did then start to move, but that was in the interest of their own safety, frankly, at this time of war. And you've got to remember how much there was a lot of population exchange going on between these regions, and how Jews themselves were being expelled or were choosing to move out of other Arab countries in order to come back to this area. And so there's a lot of movement going on at the time. This isn't to be seen in isolation. And next to that is the fact that many of those Arabs in that region chose to stay, weren't afraid, and chose to stay, and ended up becoming part of what is the Israeli population today, which contains 20% Arab. So it isn't a mass expulsion on ethnic grounds. It is a factor of this time of war. It's not premeditated. It's the Jewish need to survive as a nation, as an early nation. It causes a defensive measure in a village like Deir Yassin. And I think subsequent to that, very shortly afterwards, there was this retaliation from the Arabs, from the Muslims, who attacked a medical convoy, which has a certain irony to it when the attacking of medical convoys is now used as a tool of propaganda when it comes to accusing Israel of doing it when it hasn't. They attacked the Hadassah medical convoy in the massacre that killed 80 Jews of largely doctors in this convoy going to a hospital shortly afterwards. But of course, that's erased from their history of it because they only want you to hear the word Nakba in the end.
Yeah, in the run-up to British forces leaving and the Zionists declaring Israel an independent state, there was a siege of Jerusalem because Jerusalem, there was one narrow road. I think maybe now there's more than that one, but that's still the main one. And yeah, there's hills around it, and Jews were attacked when they were bringing in food and of course weapons. But when you hear today about Israel being evil because it's not feeding the people who are trying to kill all Jews, put that in the context of the war to make sure Israel doesn't exist included an attempt to starve the Jews in Jerusalem, in the Jewish quarter. And just Candice, I know you're watching. So before there was Israel, when the British were there and when the Arabs were in control of some areas, there were areas that Jews couldn't go. Now, even the Muslims who don't want Jews around, they don't have that kind of choice because it is a country where you cannot actually discriminate to that extent. Marco, Richard mentioned the Jews who were kicked out of Arab countries, and in terms of resources to find out more about that, you can go to the UN Agency for Jewish Refugees from Arab countries. Do you remember the name of that agency?
Of course, no. It's an agency to promote the Palestinian culture. It's specific for that task. I can't remember what we talked about.
There's certainly no Jewish one, is there?
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And what Richard was saying about the possibility that Israel used the technique of inflating the number of casualties in order to scare the local population into fleeing also testifies of the kind of methodology the Israeli use even today. They try to minimize the civilian casualties, even as far back as 48, where people tend to be less politically correct, even in war. You see that they're using techniques that try to minimize the loss of life. And it's exactly the kind of stuff that they indulge into today, wrongly, as far as I can think, by telling areas we're about to bomb, dropping leaflet, making phone calls, sending texts, all this kind of stuff that's designed, again, to reduce collateral damage. But that in the end is counterproductive because it goes to help the Hamas people who are hiding in the targets that have been specified. But again, talking about the pro-Hamas and pro-Palestinian propaganda out there, you will find we talked about how Wikipedia is incredibly slanted towards the Palestinian cause. And if you go to the page of the Deir Yassin incident, you will find an endless list of victims, which not only have the name and surname of the victim involved in the massacre, but also have a column that specifies the ridiculous circumstances in which they died. One, I seem to recall, was it died in the hands of their mother. It's like, what the hell? This was composed decades after. And even the reassessment was done decades after. Are you telling me that these numbers are actually correct? Whoever put this list together knew exactly the facts and how it happened. We're talking about 76, 77 years ago. So imagine how accurate the old machine was. But yeah, today Wikipedia is able to tell you who died, in which terrible circumstances caused by the Israelis this thing occurred. Of course, if you go to the page of the counterattack, the convoy that was attacked in retaliation, you will find a couple of paragraphs, and that's it. Again, shows the imbalance of this whole war. There is a massive propaganda going on in favor of Palestinians, and the little in favor of Israel usually attacked quite viciously.
It's telling, sorry, just cut in, but it's telling to, when you look at current events, as they were portrayed on Wikipedia, you look at like the Ariana Grande Manchester bombing, for example, that doesn't list the names of the victims, even on the Wikipedia page for it. So it's telling how suddenly somebody's able to come up with every single person who lived in this, in the exact circumstances in which they were died, because it suits a propaganda purpose. But certainly that's not reflected. There are no Jewish victims. There are no UK victims when it comes to Islamist terror.
Yeah, and when you look up pretty much anything related to this war, you will encounter so much of this. I mean, the Al Ali Hospital example with the article from a couple of days ago is really so telling, because again, it was the BBC, among others, who apologized for immediately repeating the Hamas lie of Israel bombed it, 500 died, when they realized there's footage, Israel did not bomb it. Nowhere near 500 died, nowhere near 100 died. But we were talking before the show, and we were wondering when the term Nakba was first used in reference to the creation of the state of Israel. The answer is 1948 in a book by somebody from Lebanon, but that's not the point I'm going to make here. So I Googled it, and I Googled Nakba origins, and then you know it's vague enough that it mostly tells me about the Nakba. So Google gives you the AI results first, and among the key events and factors, there is 1948 Arab-Israeli War. The declaration of Israel's independence in 1948 triggered the first Arab-Israeli war, resulting in the displacement of over half the Palestinian population. The amount of lies or intentional misuse of words in there is incredible. I'll have to count it later, but yeah. So Israel declared independence. That is the reason that there was a war. It's not Arabs didn't want Jews to live, and that is the reason. It resulted in the displacement. Yeah, it resulted because they fought, and some of them didn't want to fight, so they left until they can come back. And some of them did want to fight, and then they realized they were about to lose, so they left. Yeah, that's tough. And then another key point here is displacement and dispossession. Zionist paramilitary groups launched attacks, and the war led to mass displacement of Palestinians, leaving them as refugees. So at this point, they are actually blaming Israel, weirdly enough, or the Zionists before Israel. And then it gives you some of the sources. And yeah, one of them is Wikipedia. One of them is the United Nations. One of them is Al Jazeera. So careful when you Google things, Google them, because that's where we search for things, but Google them carefully.
For sure, and AI is a classic, isn't it, for taking the grey average of the errors of the mob and presenting them as fact. And of course, we know that just because the majority state an opinion doesn't make it in any way related to the truth, even if it's taking from repeat websites that will copy each other. The truth is still what's based in reality, what's based on facts. And one of those facts is the fact that we're often made to think that the Palestinians are their own ethnicity, have their own nationhood from the beginning, and that is a retrospective thing that is added in to this group of people who lived in this region, who are Arab Palestinians. And I think we need to stress the fact that they saw themselves as part of the big Arab Muslim community of the whole of the Middle East. It was an Arab Muslim identity, even at the time, not a Palestinian one, even though the Palestinians are now up there as the mascots for all of the Arab Muslim community that exists today, even though when it actually comes down to it, as many of the shows that we've done on this channel have highlighted, there's lots of animosity between Arab countries in the Middle East. The only thing they're unified on is the anti-Jew position, which so many take.
Yeah, I'm rewatching Mad Men for the 5th time, and I think this would be Don Draper's advice to the Arabs. Don't say we want our 23rd, 24th country or whatever. Say this is a different nation somehow. The Palestinians, change the name if the previous name didn't work, and claim to be the victim, where really as we know, they are victims in the sense that the war that they started didn't go the way they were hoping it would go.
Going back to the AI results, of course, it's an LLM. So Ayn Rand didn't know AI, but she spoke about the middle of the road, the person who takes the average or the average. And that's what you get really nowadays. So you have so much propaganda out there on the pro-Palestinian side that it will skew the view of the result of the AI. But if you actually drill down a bit and force the AI to actually be a bit more critical, you can actually see a proper picture. I do it all the time. It's actually quite fun. But to go back to the Palestinian issue, now, up to the 70s, we had the issue where you had the Jews, which went through the Holocaust, and they had an area where they were historically present. Now, this in itself doesn't give them a right to be in the land that they occupy now. However, the other side, the Palestinians, when they were invented as a district, needed a similar story, which was quite successful. You had the population that was devastated by the Holocaust. You had their original land. So nobody would have ever said, well, Israel shouldn't exist. But to create a counter-argument, of course, you create the ethnicity, the Palestinians, and then you had to create a claim to the land. And the claim to the land is a Nakba, based on this made-up set, not totally made up, but it's a fake narrative attached to an historic event, which has a background, has a context. And all you need to do is just ignore the context, just focus on the bit you want to do, and you create your narrative. And that's how they cannot fight on a level field with Israel, because Israel is a productive society. They got weapons, they're able to defend themselves. We see how able they are to defend themselves. So the other side, all it can do, create a very good propaganda and try and change the minds of the people by effectively tricking, gaslighting people to this extent. And it seems to be working if you judge by the comments I see on social media, by the kind of people we're talking about, the big influencers, the people who talk on various podcasts. So that's the kind of fight that's going on up there in parallel to the military one. The military one is obviously one-sided. However, Israel chooses not to use its might to terminate the threat once and for all. But that's a different discussion.
Yeah, and while today we are mostly going through the facts, we keep saying, this is a war of values. The difference is on values, not on facts. Nobody, while it's a big deal for the pro-Palestinian side to make sure you get not the facts, but their story of the facts. Nobody is supporting Hamas today because too many people were killed in Deir Yassin. People are supporting Hamas because they are more aligned with their values, and that should be remembered, and remembered especially if you're going to talk to people who are on this side, never let them get away with using a word like rights, for example. The Palestinians have a right to the land, because that's not, first of all, that's not what rights mean. Rights pertain to individuals. You don't have a right to endless plot of desert because you are the correct number on the Pantone chart. That's not what rights are. Rights pertain to an individual human, and it's fundamentally your right to your own life. And of course, no Palestinian faction is actually fighting for rights. They are fighting for the extermination of the Jews, and they differ on what they want to replace the Jewish state, the Jewish state, which is democratic and rights respecting to a large degree, what they want to replace it with. Do they want to replace it with a theocracy? Do they want to replace it with a fascist regime? Do they want to replace it with communism? Nobody says, let's replace it with a country that respects all the rights of all its citizens. Unlike Israel, by the way, which when it declared independence and knew that war was coming, made a point of saying, look, it's in the Declaration of Independence. that there will be no discrimination against anybody, and that was obviously specifically meant for any Arabs who were going to stay, that they shouldn't have the same concern that they know Jews should have if they find themselves living in an Arab state.
I think when it comes to those values, one of the things we need to look at in comparing then and now, because the values are eternal, the values have the same impact and should have the same emphasis as now, is this moral relativism that is taking place endlessly. And the fact that the US, for example, in the muddled mess that it is now, and I'm going to reference in a second how it was a bit of a muddled mess even back then in 1948 with Truman, but how you need the strong support of allies to clearly say which is the good side, which is the bad side, which is the side that is guilty of initiating force and therefore deserves to be pushed back, and which is trying to create a free society based on protecting individual rights and should be supported. Now, in the case of Truman back in 1948, he was supposed to be supporting the partition, but it turned out, and this documentary highlighted it particularly well, the fact that his own ambassador, the US ambassador to the United Nations, announced at the UN that they were supporting the trusteeship in Israel, and that was clearly not what Truman had intended, and he didn't even find out about it until the following day. So his own policy presented at the UN was the exact opposite of what he wanted, what America wanted, and it goes to show how even then the organization, the administration in the US, and that link between the White House and what's said at the UN needs to be consistent, needs to be clear, and needs to present a clear case of who's in the right and who's in the wrong. Otherwise, all it does is help those in the wrong. And whether it's neutrality or incompetence, all it does is make that clear distinction unclear when it should be precisely the opposite. It should be laid clearly before everyone.
Thank you, John, for the super chat, and thank you, John, for another super chat. Thank you, Jonathan, for a super chat, and thank you, Jonathan, for another super chat.
Yeah, if you look at 48 and the kind of state of the world at the time, it's quite amusing to see how the parallels are so incredibly similar to today. For example, as Rich pointed out, Truman and Democrats turned out to create a bit of a mess with the UN partition, also with the UN proposal for the partition, switching from the two states to the trustship. It was a mess. And of course, in Britain, because Churchill lost in 45 the election, we had a liberal government. Attlee was the prime minister, and they weren't terribly in favor of Israel again. The British Empire turned out to abstain from the vote for the resolution 181, which established the state of Israel. So, things have not changed that much. We see that the same entities behaving the same way for obvious reason. And that's why when you look, as Razi was pointing out earlier on, how the nature of the Palestinian state, this thing that they want to create, is got actually nothing to do with looking after the individuals. We've seen what happens in 2005 when Gaza was handed over to the Palestinians. What did they do with it? They created a war machine designed to destroy Israel. Rather than spending all those billions in making their own life better, in increasing the capacity, the productivity, and the level of life for the citizens in Gaza, they chose to go the opposite way. So a population, a group that actually wants to create a state or some kind of body that goes against individual rights, it's not something that can use the word rights. It's not something that has the right to infringe somebody else's rights. That's absolutely a perversion of the use of the rights. You haven't got the right to make somebody else's life impossible.
Last year, or up until last year, when I was criticizing the conservative government, I was often accused of being a Tony Blair supporter. going to now maybe be accused of being an athlete supporter, which of course I'm not, but I will be criticizing Churchill when it comes to his approach to the Jews in Israel, because even while the Holocaust was going on, Britain prevented Jews from coming in and basically sent them back to their death. So when you hear stuff about Jewish militias in Palestine in the under the British Mandate, they were saving lives. This was defensive action that they took, military action. So yeah, just to put that in context. Again, you had 33 countries voting for it in the UN. You had Britain abstaining. You had the US changing its mind. You had Israel eventually coming into existence, I think, in large part thanks to the Soviet Union, who chose to arm the Zionist movement, which was, of course, very socialist at the time. It's a bit less socialist now. So, oddly enough, I always have this issue when the left criticizes Trump, or the left here criticizes the conservatives, and I'm like, these people deserve proper criticism, but the left doesn't have an issue with the bad things they do because the left wants the same. So yeah, sometimes the criticism where criticism is valid, and if you want to say, oh, look at the early Zionist movement, look at what's wrong with it. Maybe talk about the socialism, not the insistence that Jews stay alive and have a state.
And also maybe look at the actions of the populations themselves and how the contrast clearly is and how it's a reflection of their values. I mean, take, for example, when you look at all the movie tone footage, little news clips like the Pathé clips from the early 40s, you can see lots of areas of Israel being developed by Jews who are plowing this terrible land, who are planting orange groves, who are basically getting it into a fertile state where it could be productive, building structures and homes, and the extent to which it was developed quickly by very hardworking Jewish people who were doing their best to make a life for themselves is quite clear in that footage, as opposed to what happened, say, in Gaza since 2005, when after the disengagement, when the only interest, it seems, in Gazans was to smuggle in weapons, to dig tunnels underneath the Gaza, and to ensure that it was the underground that was the area that was built most, and not what was above ground. Clearly, that's one of the contrasts you can see. And when it comes to what the British did in terms of some of their mistakes, we've got things like the siege of Jerusalem, where the British are making sure that there isn't a single weapon that can get into Jerusalem to help the Jews defend themselves against the Arabs who are besieging the city they're living in, which is essentially simply helping the enemy, helping the wrong side when it comes to the region, and all adds to this muddled mess, which means that it isn't clear which side is being supported, and the actions are demonstrating that they aren't clear on that point when they absolutely should be.
I see some people in the chat mentioning that Palestinian at the time referred mostly to the Jews living in the area, but not exclusively, basically to people living there. And Arabs didn't really want to be associated with the term because it kind of is associated with Jews, which they didn't like. I saw a week ago or so, and I replied to this on Twitter, one of the 5 or so, can I call them Hamas members of parliament in the UK, or is that very pro-Hamas members of parliament who got elected a year ago on that single issue of supporting the people who did October 7th. And one of them, in response to somebody saying there has never been a Palestinian state, posted a picture of a coin. Now, the coin says Palestine, and of course, that's what the area was called, and he uses it as as proof that a Palestinian state exists. But of course, it also says in Hebrew, Palestina and Eretz Israel. So that's that. If he actually was questioned about that and decided to get into it, I wonder where he would have gone. But bear in mind, if you are actually talking to people who might be honestly mistaken because everybody says that Israel is in the wrong. Everybody says that Israel has been doing this since 1948. Yeah, don't let people so easily get away with it. And yeah, okay.
Yeah, on YouTube itself, you can actually find videos of matches from 1939. One is Australia versus Palestine. And who's playing for Palestine? Well, it's Maccabi Tel Aviv players. Because, again, the Palestinians at the time were the people who lived in the region called Palestinian. So it's a bit like, say, Californians. It's not a state as such, but it's an area, it's a region. It doesn't give you any rights, the fact that you live in somewhere, as opposed to somebody else who lives somewhere else. And again, go online if you want to verify certain facts. Go to the Pathé website. The archives are open to anyone to see. You see the footage in the past, as Richard pointed out. You see Israeli building stuff in Israel. You see all sorts of images and reports from the time. And you also see the kind of attitude that certain governments had at the time, especially around 48. So there never was a Palestinian state. There was an area called Palestinian, but again, this has been hijacked by the propaganda in order to legitimize the claim of the so-called Palestinian people.
Can I just say there is a Palestinian national football team today, and if any Maccabi Tel Aviv player is called up and chooses to go, don't come back. Look, the more likes, the more comments, the more people share this, the more people who go on YouTube and search for Nakba see this rather than anti-Israel propaganda. So I encourage everybody who got value out of this and think that others will as well to like, share, comment. I think comments are the algorithm's favorite way of saying, yeah, people are interested. So yeah, consider doing that. Parting thoughts, Richard?
Yeah, well, I mean, the creation of Israel is its justice and its redemption for Jews following the Second World War. It's a necessity that Jews needed in order to be able to survive at all. And of course, that is the very thing which the Arabs and Muslims across the region wanted to prevent and to cut off at source. And they've been trying ever since. To different extents, and of course we're currently going through one of the most risky times for Jews in very different parts of the world, where they should have many friends among Western countries supporting the right values, and too many are supporting those wrong values, which ultimately, when people look at all of the facts, we'll see it's the annihilation of Jews that is what motivates their enemies, and that is what you're supporting when you support those enemies against Israel.
Marco,
yes, no amount of propaganda can actually hide the fact that what the nature of the Palestinian people is. It's a bunch of people who make quite clear that they don't want to share any space on this planet with the Jews. They don't want the Jews, they don't want their state. So just look at the stuff out there. Don't just believe my word. Look at all the documents out there. Look at what the Palestinians tell you. Look what the various Islamic groups tell you. And take them to their words, because they mean it. They showed it a number of times that they mean it.
I see that PC just asked a question that I was going to answer even without you asking. Yeah, one of the most popular, I guess, pro-Hamas propaganda outlets in the West is Democracy Now! If you haven't seen their YouTube channel, for you, we have. We'll watch some more of it, and that will be the topic of tomorrow's episode of the reality show. I believe on Friday we are going to finally talk about Katie Halper, although we've been saying that for a while, and she really isn't that important. She's just despicably eloquent enough to cover. And yeah, again, share it if you think this is of value, and of course, subscribe if you're not subscribed. This is the first time we've ever done the reality show in front of a live audience. Hopefully, the first of many. So thanks guys for joining me. Thanks everybody for watching, and thanks to our live audience. We are back tomorrow with the Daily Objective and the reality.